So I'm going to talk today about working on public sector projects. So I'll do a quick intro. So I currently work at Government Property Agency. So we are in charge of the government office estate. My role is currently refurbishing and modernising government office buildings up and down Whitehall for new modernised and smaller and leaner civil service offices that are more suited to hybrid working. So before I had this job, I worked in Cabinet Office for a year, and I was working with school and hospital building teams. And then before that, I was a structural engineer and I worked at Elliott Wood. So topics to cover. I'm painfully aware policy is a bit dry at the best of times. I will try and make this as interesting as I can. So we'll start with what policy and documents currently exist that you should be aware of to work on these kind of projects. Touch on the direction of travel of policy, and then finish on how to help your clients, essentially what public sector clients need from their design teams, and how you can help make a real difference. I'm not a policy expert, I'm in delivery. So while I know a bit about them, I'm by no means an expert, but I'm happy to attempt to field any questions. Right. So before we start and get into the gory policy bit, I will just tell you a quick story from a current project, which I'm working on now. What we're doing is we're closing an old kind of carbon guzzling 60s building, moving all the staff into a smaller refurbished building. And that will be finished in about 3 weeks, which is where I'm sitting now. So if you hear a fire alarm or the lights go off, that's what's happening. What we wanted to do was to take as many fixtures out of the building we're closing as possible and move them over to the new one. And one of the suggestions from the design team was the security turnstiles, which are in this photo. So I thought I would read out some of the quotes from the client team as to why this would never work. So I'm just reading them off my screen. They'll probably clash with a downstand beam. They're probably too heavy. There'll be a warranty problem. By the time you dismantle them and rebuild them, it will be more expensive. It won't work with the program. The tenant will say no, or there'll be a redesign charge. If it doesn't work, we'll all look stupid. And my favorite, it's just a faff, isn't it? So a good proportion of those were me. And I think there is a moral to the story somewhere deep down. One of the things is, if you have an idea, don't be afraid to keep pushing it, because sometimes when it sounds like it's too difficult, you'll get a lot of resistance, and it's going to take a lot of effort to get through that, to push an idea through. You might just need to persevere. And I suppose sometimes just bear in mind your client might be under a lot of pressure and might be nervous about doing something that backfires. But I think if you have conviction that the idea is good, help them take down some of the barriers to getting it done, because I think what we did do here was the opposite of all the problems that I highlighted, and actually worked really well. And here are a load of turnstiles that could have just gone straight into a skip and didn't. So if you have an idea, have the conviction to try and push it through, because you're probably right. So if we get stuck into the policy bit. So the context of all the current policies they're underpinned by a number of overarching targets and acts. So the main one is the net zero commitment by 2050. We also got the government commitment to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and a general presumption in favour of sustainable development. Got the 2021 Environment Act. You may know what these are, you may not. I don't think you need to read them, but that's the kind of thing that sits over the top of all the policies that exist. Public sector is quite difficult to navigate if you're not familiar with it. There's a lot of different organisations, government is not one single entity, and you've got central government, local government, and then agency. So you really need to know your client, because the requirements will vary. For example, if you're a hospital building, you'll be employed directly as a designer or maybe under D&B by a contractor. but the actual sustainability or general requirements that you have to fulfill are going to vary depending on who your end client is. So you need to do a bit of reading up on what that is, because even if you're under D&B, it's likely those requirements will filter down to you. You may find that some departments require, for instance, it's not really structural related, but some departments require neighbours as well as BREEAM, and some don't. So it's quite a complex landscape, but generally everything you need is available online. If you're bidding for big frameworks, for instance, you'll have probably teams in your organisations who are all over this stuff. If you're more of a smaller business, you may need just to do a bit of reading up before you go in on a project. There are some key documents that do cover every department and every project, so that's the best place to focus your energy probably. And there is a lot of work ongoing, to be fair, to try and align all this so it's less murky and easier to get your head around. So I'll just go through what the main documents are that are worth having a look at and pull out some of the key messages, because they're quite long-winded and there's not a lot of obvious structural elements in them. I just realised I think my camera's gone off, so I'm just going to put that back on. There we go. Okay, so here we go. I would say these are probably the 3 key documents to be aware of. So the first one is called TIP, or Transforming Infrastructure Performance. So these documents that cover all departments tend to be issued by the centre, so Cabinet Office essentially. So this first one is from IPA. This is about all infrastructure, not just buildings, and a lot of it is about energy use as well as structure. So what I tried to do is just pull out some key messages. So first one on TIP is a focus on MMC. If you're working on particularly larger projects, but also covering smaller things, you're going to have to justify, or at least show that you've really explored all avenues to include MMC. There's varying definitions of what is considered MMC and what isn't, but expect to have to demonstrate that it's been seriously looked into. The other key theme on this document is it does specifically pull out a preference for retrofit, and that's the phrase is optimizing existing assets rather than creating new assets. So I know that is a theme that has been around for a long time, and a lot of you will have been doing this and thinking about this and using this to drive design for ages, but this document is new, I think, last year. So it's good to actually see it explicitly stated. And again, it's something you can use to convince your clients to go in a certain direction if it's sort of clearly written in policy. Okay, next document is the construction playbook. This is probably the most important one. That it talks a lot about, it's more about how government buys work. So generally it's contractor focused, but that also then again filters down to any subcontractors, which would include designers. So anybody working under D&B. So there, another few key themes. Again, it's sort of, you'll see a lot of themes here that kind of go through everything, but digital and offsite is a big one. So essentially creating a data environment so that data can be shared and there's a sort of golden thread of information. Offsite as well on a waste reduction perspective, but that kind of the digital theme filters through there as well. Whole life carbon, that's obviously going to be a theme through everything, and it is really now expected that on major projects that whole life carbon measurement and assessments are done. This will become more and more important and eventually mandated, and so you can expect to be asked. And I know a lot of again, there's the iStructE tool, and a lot of people will be doing this already, but you can expect to start having to report on it and report quite regularly. So in terms of using an initial carbon assessment to drive decision making at the start of a project, and adding detail to that as the project progresses, and essentially updating it when new information comes out. That that's going to help the central government at least collect data and benchmarks on projects so that they can be compared against each other, and a bit like in the Letty guides, there can be a standard to aim towards in terms of what is a realistic target and what can be achieved. Carbon reduction plans, and I think Smith alluded to this as well, is it's not just about what you put into a building, it's about your organisation's plan for reducing and reporting as well carbon emissions. Anyone bidding for work, I think it's over 5 million, is going to be, the carbon reduction plan will be mandated, and it needs to be, I think, publicly published as well on a website. So that's something to be aware of. And the last one here, Smith touched on this one as well, is biodiversity net gain. So that's the concept that, again, it's not completely structural related, but I suppose there are civils elements to this, where the idea is that any development contributes to the recovery of nature, so you're sort of leaving nature in a better state than you found it. And this is going to start being mandated towards the end of this year. That's definitely one to be aware of. Last document here is called Net Zero Estate Playbook. I think that is one of the, not quite as key as construction playbook, and that's more about retrofitting existing estates. So just establishes really key principles, but there is a lot of work ongoing on the decarbonisation front, decarbonisation social housing programmes, and what I'm really doing here is a lot about decarbonising the estates, office estate. So there's a lot of work in this area, and this document outlines the kind of principles around that. And so moving on to sort of future direction of travel in this area. I talked about mandating whole life carbon assessments. This is, as I said, on a major project, on a major program at least, this will become mandated. There are lots of projects on an individual level that form part of major programs. So even if your project is not big, it doesn't mean it won't apply to you. Obviously, whole life carbon is the whole cycle of the project. It is not something that you as structural engineers can do alone. You're going to have to come together with the whole design team to do this, and it will be something that will have to be driven by the client, but will require quite a lot of effort and probably quite a lot of time. This is the kind of reporting that is going to end up being on an equivalent importance level to cost. I'll be interested to see whether that really happens, because ultimately cost is still king, and on this side of the fence, I don't really see that mindset shifting at the moment, but if it does, I think that's a really good thing. There's talk at the moment of PAS 2080 accreditation. At the moment, this is quite a costly and time-consuming thing to achieve, which means it's very difficult for smaller organisations to do it. That's why there are a lot of challenges in mandating it, because it's not very equitable, but this is being explored in terms of how it could be mandated in a fair way. So not something to be concerned about, but something to be aware of. There's also a lot more focus on neighbours and decks and EPCs. So again, not something directly structural engineering related, but one to be aware of, because that will affect the M&E designers quite a lot. So last bit, I think I'm relatively on time, is how to help your clients. So I flipped over to client side about 2 years ago, and it's very interesting being on this side of the fence, having been a designer, because it's just not obvious what the client does all day and how to make their life easier. So a few tips on how to make your client's life easier. So the first thing is we do a lot of reporting, monthly reporting, quarterly reporting. It is just all consuming. So if you're asked to do monthly reports, the better you make them, the easier your client's life is, because they can just lift and shift it. As part of that, everyone loves a good news story. So if you can pull these out, particularly carbon related good news stories, if you can pull these out in your reports, that will make you a very, very popular consultant. Of course, real outcomes are always better. Everything we do is subject to sort of not heavy press attention, but you don't want to be accused of greenwashing. So it sort of has to be real. The things that I hate the most are fake BREEAM credits that just get credits but don't result in outcomes. So generally we'd like to focus on things that actually make a difference to the environment or the end client or people, rather than just something that is full credits and not a high cost. Finding and keeping good records. I'd never really appreciated the financial and carbon cost of ripping open a building to see what the structure is and where the beams are. So the better the records are that you can find historically, and the better that records you can leave us with, helps us manage the building in a more sustainable way, and ultimately eventually refurbish it, demolish it, reuse it in a more sustainable way. And the last one is don't stay in your lane. If you've got an idea, people do want to hear it, and I think it's easy to feel like it's an idea or something at the something brought to the table that's not in your remit or not part of your business. But I think clients really are open to hear off the wall ideas, even if they don't work. Like Smith was saying, this is not trying to hit these net zero targets. It's not about +1 here, -1 here. It is a real mindset shift, and we do need people who want to really change things to come to the table and bring ideas. So get in early and don't stray away from being a bit radical and saying what you think. And I think that is it from me.